Hi again. I needed to move for reasons, and I started to bring the candle in here, but then I realized that, like, this lighting, because all of this lighting, this is from my computer screen with Flux on. Like, this program that, like, dims your screen and makes it, and, like, tints everything red so that, uh, it doesn't affect your sleep schedule as much. I started to bring the candle in here, but then I did this and I was like, this looks cool. And also the fire scares me just a little bit. The flame, usually we have it on top of things that aren't flammable, but I had it on top of flammable things and that was making me a little bit nervous. I'm getting a little bit tired, but I have more things to talk about. I have more video ideas and fun facts and fun stories that I just kind of want to get out there into the internet. So I'm going to keep talking about all kinds of random stuff until I'm either too tired to go on or I run out of things to talk about. From my perspective, a few minutes ago, we were talking about communism and economic models. Let's chill out just a little bit, maybe. Because I just have some fun stories to tell, some fun history stories, stuff that I've read online. Where online? I don't know. I think I've read I've read things that corroborate a lot of this from books. Probably all of this is from Wikipedia, but treat everything I'm about to say as hearsay, as just, like, a friend said some interesting stuff that he heard somewhere. Treat this with, like, that level of credibility. But I've wanted to make videos about certain periods of US history, especially presidential history, that just really interest me. Not things that I think are particularly important. In fact, this is a big point, because all of the important bits of US history we tend to talk a fair amount about, I think. Like, I feel like most people's idea of US history is like there was the revolution, and then a bunch of nothing happened, and then there was the Civil War, and then a bunch more nothing happened until eventually we get to World War II. And then World War II is kind of like the start of modern history, and then after that, depending on how old you are, you have a more or less firm understanding of what's happened since the 1940s. This leaves two really big gaps in a lot of people's knowledge. What happened between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and what happened between the Civil War and World War II. Although that second one is a little bit fuzzy. A lot of people know at least something about World War I. A lot of people know at least something about, like, the progressive period, like Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. But at the very least, we don't talk about the 1880s or the 1890s that much. At the very least, like, when we do talk about the 1880s or the 1890s, we talk about them in terms of the Industrial Revolution, all the economic and cultural changes that were going on at the time. We don't talk about the politics much. We don't talk a lot about, like, Grover Cleveland or Benjamin Harrison, or we don't talk nearly enough about William Jennings Bryan. But we'll get there. I'm going to go a little bit chronologically here, because I want to start with the period ending with the Revolutionary War starting with the Revolutionary War and ending with the Civil War. And I think it's useful to compare this to today, because today, all right, Trump is in office right now, right? Before him, there was Obama. He was a Democrat. He served 2 terms. Before Obama was a Republican, W. He served 2 terms. Before W was a Democrat, 2 terms. That's, like, this pattern of, like, 2 terms for a Democrat, 2 terms for a Republican, 2 terms for a Democrat, 2 terms for a Republican, like, that basic pattern, it feels really familiar to us at this point. Like, it feels like there's this pattern that's been going on forever, almost. I have friends who are who believe this, who feel like this pattern holds so strongly that, like, they would bet on their lives that Trump is going to win that Trump is going to win re-election, and then that after him there's going to be a Democrat. Like, and that's a little bit weird because you don't actually have to go back that far before you find an exception. Like, Clinton won the 1992 presidential election against an incumbent president. Like, George H.W. Bush only served one term, and he served from 1989 to 1993. Like, that is not that long ago. That's just a few years before I was born. And but it still mostly holds. If you look at just like which party has held the presidency, then starting with Obama, it's like 8 years of Democrat, 8 years of Republican, 8 years of Democrat, 12 years of Republican, 4 years of Democrat, 8 years of Republican, 8 years for Democrat, 8 years for Republican. So like, except for that one exception where Republicans got 12, except for that one time when Republicans got 12 years and Democrats got 4, that pattern of of switching between the parties for the presidency every 8 years, that pattern, besides that one exception, holds all the way back to Harry Truman, like right after World War II. That's like all of modern history. So there is something to this pattern. But I think it's worth remembering that like that's not the only way it can be. And in fact, this pattern is actually not the norm in American history. Like, let's go from the beginning. I would say that so there's this period that most people don't know a lot about, from the Revolutionary War up to the Civil War, right? I would say that period, you can further divide that period in half based on the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was president from, let's see if I can remember this, 1829 to 1837, if I'm remembering that right. And he changed politics, or like, it might be better to say that politics changed around his time. Like, politics was changing when he took office, and he had a lot to do with that. Because politics before Andrew Jackson and politics after Andrew Jackson, like politics from the Revolutionary War up to Jackson and politics from Jackson up to the Civil War, are almost complete opposites. Like, really, really. These two periods from from 1800 to 1820, those 20 years, is basically the polar opposite of 1840 to 1860. 1800 to 1820, only one party had the presidency. 1800 to 1820, we had, actually, like, more accurately, like, 1801 to 1825, that period of 24 years, we had 3 presidents, and they were all of the same party. 3 presidents in a row, each of whom served 3 presidents in a row, each of whom served 2 terms, all from the same party, the Democratic Republicans. 3 presidents in 24 years, all of the same party. Like, that's insane to me. Like, that is a quarter century of basically one party rule. We don't talk, like, we focus on how at the very beginning of our country there was the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, right? On the Federalist side you had George Washington and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and on the Democratic Republican side you had Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and some other people. And I mostly know all of these names from Hamilton. That's a lie. I can think of them more quickly because of Hamilton. But the thing about that is that was only competitive for a really short amount of time. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were kind of neck and neck. They were like kind of evenly matched for a little while. But we only technically ever had one Federalist president, and that's John Adams, because George Washington didn't like political parties. We only technically had one Federalist president, and he was defeated, he didn't win re-election. He was defeated after one term. The period from we had George Washington for 2 terms, then we had 1 term of John Adams, our only technically Federalist president, and then after that, we had 24 years of control of the presidency and pretty solid control of both houses of Congress by the Democratic Republicans. And when you think about how much the Founding Fathers hated political parties, this kind of made sense. Like, the Founding Fathers hated political parties because they thought it would, like, tear the country apart. They thought it would be disruptive. So the fact that one party was dominating, most people saw that as actually pretty good news. People saw that as like, oh good, if there's only one party, then things can be nice and chill and calm. Like, it wasn't until Jackson that people kind of got on board with the idea of a multi-party system where the 2 parties were more or less evenly matched. And after Jackson, hoo boy, because, like, from 1840 to 1860, not a single president got reelected. Not a single president won reelection. In those first 24 years, every president got reelection. But from 1840 to 1860, no president got reelection, and 2 of them died in office. So we actually had more, like, for those, in that period of, like, 20 years, we had more presidents than we had presidential terms. And the reason for that is really interesting, because Andrew Jackson terrified a lot of people, because people thought he was monarchical. People thought that he was autocratic. People thought that he was getting way too much power for himself, and he was right. Or they were right. Like, they were right about Andrew Jackson. Like, Andrew Jackson is fascinating to me. He is also appalling to me. There are things about him I like, but he kind of ruined our political system, honestly. Like, if the Trail of Tears wasn't enough, he also... The veto was seen as an emergency power until Andrew Jackson. Like, the veto was supposed to be something that the president uses if Congress goes completely off the rails. But now, it's just kind of accepted that the presidency is, like, a co-equal partner in the process of creating legislation. Like, it's just kind of accepted that the president is going to veto everything he doesn't like. So Congress doesn't, like, isn't even a point for Congress to pass something that the president isn't going to like. That wasn't the case before. Like, the veto was supposed to be something that it was supposed to be like a break glass in case of Congress goes completely insane. Andrew Jackson used the veto more than every president before him combined. He made the veto a normal policy tool. And I really hate him for that. Like, I really wish that the president was just, like, a civil servant who just, like, picked good administrators. Like, I hate that so much power is vested in one person in our democracy. And I blame Andrew Jackson for a lot of that. And a lot of people at the time felt the same way. A lot of people at the time just could not stand how much power... It wasn't just the veto thing. Andrew Jackson invested a ton of power in the presidency that wasn't really there before, and a lot of people were terrified about that. So after Andrew Jackson, a ton of people who ran for president ran with a 1-term promise. A lot of them ran promising, I'm only going to serve 1 term. And that, as a result, like, a lot of them didn't even run for re-election. And a lot of the ones who did were defeated, because after Andrew Jackson, everyone was scared stiff of anyone, like, consolidating power in the hands of one person. After Andrew Jackson, no one wanted that to happen, so no one was willing to re-elect any president. We had 3 presidents for 24 years. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. And they were all from the same party. But from 1840 to 1860, power went back and forth a whole lot. We had a Democrat administration, then we had a Whig administration, then Democrat, then Whig, then back to Democrat. We had, let me see if I can get this right. After Andrew Jackson was Van Buren for 4 years, and then we had 4 years of Whigs, 4 years of Democrats, 4 years of Whigs, then 8 years of Democrats, and then the Civil War. So the Democrats and the Whigs were really neck and neck. Like 1840 to 1860 was the first time when we had like a really competitive system of like federal politics. Like our modern system is closer to that 1840 to 1860 period, but when the Democrats and the Whigs were at each other's throats, our system is closer to that than like most other periods of U.S. politics. And so this is there's one thing that's a little bit hilarious to me here. So the Whig Party, right? Not many people know about it. It was, compared to other parties, it was relatively short-lived. It was founded essentially to oppose Andrew Jackson. Like, the Whigs were the party of people who hate Andrew Jackson. And when the Civil War rolled around, thing is, slavery was becoming like the issue anyone was talking about, but the Whigs weren't willing to divide their base, because some people who hated Andrew Jackson loved slavery, some people who hated Andrew Jackson hated slavery. So there were a lot of Whigs on both sides of that, and the Whigs didn't want to alienate either of them, so they wound up alienating both of them, and that's why the Whigs don't exist today. The Democrats just straight up like split in half, but then like reformed afterwards. The Democrats also had a rough time. But the Whig Party was interesting because even though it was basically founded as like a bunch of people who hate Andrew Jackson, it also had a lot of interesting policy goals. And those policy goals were essentially like inherited by the Republicans after the Civil War simmered down. Those policy goals, the Whigs and the Republicans in the 1800s, they were similar in a lot of ways. Like I'm not the first to point out that the Republicans are really like, not just because they opposed the Democrats, like the Democrats survived this whole period, not just because the Republicans and the Whigs both opposed the Democrats, but that's not the only thing they had in common. They both, early on, were both more pro-business and pro-government intervention in the economy. Because at the time, people actually saw those as kind of the same thing. Like, things were really kind of reversed back then compared to how they are now. Like, today, if you think that big business... Like, today, if you're pro-big business, you are anti the government getting involved in the economy. Whereas if you're anti-big business, and, like, if you think poor people have it too rough... If you think poor people have it too rough and the government should do something about it, you probably think the government should, like, actively do something about it, like, go in and help. But that's not how it was in the 1800s. In the 1800s, in the 1800s, the government helping the little guy meant staying out of things. Like, things that the government did at the time included tariffs and central banking and funding railroads and infrastructure. All of those things actually helped big businesses at the time, especially big like local businesses in the US, because the US was, for a long time, the US was not competitive on an international market, and for big business and for like businessmen in the US to thrive, for capitalists in the US to thrive, the US government actually needed to step in and protect them from competition from outside. The U.S. government also needed to like build railroads and like coordinate a central banking system in order to make a lot of big business and capitalist stuff like function properly. Like, at the time, the government stepping out of things was seen as the government like letting the capitalists just kind of die on their own so that the little guy, the yeoman farmer or whatever, could like just do his own thing. So Republicans and Whigs were the party, both of them, they were the party of big business. Like, you know, people talk about how the Democrats and Republicans have switched over time. Like, Democrats like saying that, Republicans don't like saying that. The truth is somewhere in between. They switched in some ways and they didn't in others. It's definitely true that, black people switched their vote. Like, black people used to vote overwhelmingly for Republicans, now they vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. But some things haven't changed. There's a bunch of states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. Those, like, the Plains states, they vote Republican now. They voted Republican in the 1800s. Like, some groups switched parties, in fact, most groups switched parties, but some didn't. And one of the things that's stayed consistent over time is that the Republicans, they are, and they actually always have been, the party of big business. And that, seems weird to us now, but if you think about it, like, in the context of the Civil War, the Republican Party was designed to kind of oppose slavery. But one thing to keep in mind is that, like, the people who became the people who we now think of as, like, the big business owners, they were kind of threatened by slaves, by slave owners. They were threatened by slavery. Like, people, Confederate apologists like talking about how it was a competition between, like, two ways of life or economic systems or something like that. There's a little bit of truth to that. I don't want to talk too much about what the Civil War was about, but it was about slavery. But the reason a lot of people opposed slavery wasn't so much because they were against racism or because they wanted to protect black people. A lot of people at the time were against slavery because it kind of threatened their way of life. A lot of people in the North, their way of life was kind of based around capitalism, basically. It was based around markets. But not just that. It was based around a very particular idea of capitalism. It was based around an idea of kind of the yeoman farmer, of the independent farmer who owns his own land and sells his crops on the open market or otherwise just keeps them and grows stuff for himself. But how is the yeoman farmer who just grows his own stuff, or the businessman trying to, like, transport that stuff over railroads, how are either of them supposed to compete with a slave owner who doesn't have to pay his workers? Slavery was threatening both to the poor farmer in the North and to the rich business owner in the North. So the Republicans were founded as the anti-slavery party, but they found themselves allied with capitalists at the time, with business owners at the time. So Republicans, they were founded as, like, the anti-slavery party, but they have always been the party of big business. So that's interesting. And the Whigs were the party of big business before the Republicans were. I've gotten kind of sidetracked. The Whigs were the party of big business before the Republicans were. They were the party of fund railroads, organize a national bank, like, have high tariffs to protect local industry and local business. But anyone who hated Andrew Jackson kind of got on board. And honestly, I want to narrow in on this one little bit. So, all right, I want to tell a little story. This is all the context you need to know, okay? All right, so I want to transport you guys to 1841, I believe. I think that was the year. I think that was the year William Henry Harrison took office. William Henry Harrison was the first ever Whig president. Before William Henry Harrison was Van Buren, and before Van Buren was Jackson. So this is very soon after Jackson. Like, everyone is still trying to figure out what politics is going to be like in a post-Jackson world. Like, all of that is still pretty up in the air. Like, I talked about this period of, like, Whigs versus Democrats that lasted from 1840 to 1860. We're in 1841 now. We're at the very beginning of that. Everyone's still kind of trying to get their footing, and no one's quite sure how anything is going to go down. William Henry Harrison, he's the first ever Whig elected president. He's, like, the Whigs are a brand new party. And William Henry Harrison, how quickly did he die? Weeks, months. William Henry Harrison, today, if you know about William Henry Harrison, it's because you know him as the president who had the shortest time in office, because William Henry Harrison wasn't in office, I think it was weeks after his inauguration that he died of an illness of some sort. What illness he died of is really interesting. SciShow did some cool videos about how there might have been, like, really bad, like, infected water at the White House, and that might have actually killed, like, 3 presidents over time. Like, some while they were in office, some after they left office, but that's beside the point. Point for our story is that William Henry Harrison died very quickly in office. And today, this seems interesting. It's interesting that he died so quickly to us. But I don't think today we quite appreciate how big a deal it was at the time, because here's the thing. A president had never died in office before. This was the first time. Like, the country was pretty new. The country was only like 50 years old. Like, Washington was elected as our first president in 1789, I think. And we're in 1841. Yeah, the country was 52 years old. The country was really young. So, we had never had a president die in office before. Now, the Constitution says that when a president dies in office, the vice president now becomes president. But here's the interesting thing. It's a little ambiguous. Because if all it says is if the president dies, the vice president becomes president, here's the thing. Do you hold emergency elections? Today, the answer is obvious. Today, the answer is no. But the Constitution doesn't say you don't hold emergency elections. The Constitution is actually kind of ambiguous. Like, do you hold emergency elections? Like, as soon as you can in order to get, like, a new president in office ASAP? If you don't, the new president, like the vice president who just became president, does he serve a full 4 terms and then you have an election? Or do we have an election when we would have had an election anyway? Today, the answer is obvious, but no one knew at the time. The Constitution was kind of vague. So, William Henry Harrison dies, and his vice president, John Tyler, becomes president, and we kind of have a brief constitutional crisis. I wish I knew more about this. I wish I could read up on this. Fortunately, everyone kind of came together and agreed, okay, we're gonna have an election in 1844 exactly the way we were gonna anyway. Like, this is not gonna alter the election schedule. That was the decision we came to eventually, but it was really up in the air for a quick minute there. And some people were always kind of uncomfortable with the decision that people came to there. Some people were always kind of like, I don't know about this. I'm not comfortable with us having a president who was never elected to be president. And they stuck around for all of John Tyler's term. So what I love about this is, okay, John Tyler, he's the new president, right? He is basically the first Whig president because the real first Whig president died after like a minute in office. So John Tyler, he's the new president now, right? John Tyler joined the Whigs because he hated Jackson. That's why most people joined the Whigs. John Tyler hated Jackson. He thought that Andrew Jackson was just the worst. He thought that Andrew Jackson was a monarch, that he was taking all of the power for himself, and that if we didn't fight the people who supported Andrew Jackson, they were going to turn the United States into a dictatorship. Here's the thing, though. John Tyler thought that most of the Whig platform was unconstitutional. John Tyler hated the idea of dictatorship and monarchy and stuff, but Andrew Jackson, he consolidated a lot of power for himself, but most of what he wanted to do with that power, he's on our money, because lots of people loved him. Poor people loved him. Poor white farmers especially loved him. Most other people, but poor white farmers loved him because he consolidated power, but he also distributed it among poor people in a way that hadn't really been done up until that point. Andrew Jackson used a lot of his power to do what Democrats did for all of the 1800s. He wanted the government to stay out of the economy. Andrew Jackson hated the idea of a central bank. He hated the idea of the government funding railroads. He wanted the government to stay out of all of that so that the small, independent yeoman farmer could thrive. John Tyler was interesting because John Tyler kind of agreed with a lot of that, I think. I don't know much about how John Tyler thought about, the yeoman farmer versus the big businessman versus the slave owner, but at the very least, John Tyler believed in limited government. He was consistent about that. John Tyler believed in limited government. He wanted the government, he didn't want the president to have all of the power that it had. He didn't want the presidency to have all the power that it had. And he didn't want the government to fund railroads or have a central bank or have high tariffs either. John Tyler hated Andrew Jackson, but he also hated most of the platform of the Whig Party. So he just made no friends. The Whigs John Tyler, I'm reasonably certain, John Tyler is, up to this day, the only president who has ever been expelled from his own party. That's how much people hated him, because he, if I'm remembering right, he didn't like that Andrew Jackson had accumulated the veto, like had sort of created the veto power. He didn't like that he had concentrated all this power. But if I'm remembering right, John Tyler wasn't above using this veto power. It's like, well, if this taboo has already been broken, if everyone else is already doing it, I might as well use the veto power to veto all of the legislation my own party is passing in Congress. So John Tyler had no friends. The Whigs hated him. The Democrats hated him. Everyone hated him. I love him. He's gotten a bad rap in history. If I learned more about him, I might hate him too. If I read a lot more about him, I might learn that, like, he was a bastard, it turns out. But I love the consistency of the guy. I kind of feel the same way, you know? Like, I also think that I also have mixed feelings about, like, high tariffs. I also would have wanted what's best for, like, the poor yeoman farmer. And I also would have been really afraid of all the consolidation of power in the hands of one person that Andrew Jackson caused to happen in the presidency. Like, everything I've read about John Tyler I liked. So it's really tragic to me how much people hated him. But my favorite fact is that apparently, remember, John Tyler, it didn't help the fact that everyone hated him that he was never elected. It didn't help that he was the first ever vice president to become the president. So he got a nickname, his Accidency, which must have really stung for him. He hated how monarchical Andrew Jackson had been, so to address him with this, like, royal title that addresses the fact that he was never elected, man, that must have stung for him. His Accidency. And really amazing thing for me, the Whig Party, it only ever won 2 presidential elections, but it got 4 presidents, because both of the Whig presidents who were elected died in office. William Henry Harrison died and John Tyler took his place. Zachary Taylor died. Zachary Taylor was the 3rd Whig president. Zachary Taylor was elected. He died in office and was replaced by Millard Fillmore. The Whigs won 2 elections and got 4 presidents out of it. They were an unlucky party. The Whigs were just a train wreck of a party from beginning to end, and I love learning about it. It's great that we all learn about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and World War II. Those are, like, probably the most important parts. But when you look at the periods of history between those really big events, you see just all of this nonsense, all of this just petty squabbling and bickering, all of this politics as we know it today. You see that politics hasn't really changed all that much. You see that politicians have always been power hungry and kind of stupid and egotistical, and you see how much people make, like, just uncomfortable alliances. And you see how much politics is just based on, like, the squabbling between different people and factions, and how, in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, you can see, like, these bright ideological contrasts, but in a lot of the rest of it, it's all murky and muddy and confusing and really fun if you want to get into it. So I want to tell you another fun story to illustrate that. So, I've covered this period from 1800 to 1830 about. That was basically, we were a one-party state under Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. Then I've covered the period from, like, 1840 to 1860, which was this period of, like, the Democrats and Whigs are, like, kind of evenly contested against each other. So what about between the Civil War and World War II? Because it was kind of between the two. Civil War to World War II, I often see this described as, the Republicans and Democrats. By the way, this is a much longer period than either of the other two I've talked about. Civil War to World War II is, well, let's call it Civil War to Great Depression. So we're talking, like, 1860 1860 something up to 1832. So we're talking about like 60, 70 years here, which is longer than either of the two previous periods I've talked about. This period of 70 years from from the Civil War in the 1860s up until the Great Depression started around like 1929, whatever. This period, I've seen it described as the Democrats and the Republicans were pretty evenly divided. But if you look at who controlled the presidency, how much, and I think this also holds true a little bit for Congress, although not as much. If you just look at the presidency, you see that, like, it's dominated by the Republicans. Like, this isn't one party state, but it's also not evenly divided. It's like we have a senior party and a junior party, if that makes sense. Like, it's not a one party state, but it's also not evenly divided. There's like there's like the main party and then like the underdog party. So cause from between 1860 and 1932, in that period of like 90 years, in this period of 90 years, we only had 3 Democratic presidents. And 2 of them won re-election, but one of them was Andrew Johnson. One of them was Lincoln's vice president. Man, people don't appreciate how weird it is. Like, Andrew Johnson is the only vice president who ever became president who was of the opposite party of the president who chose him. Like, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. He picked a Democrat as his vice president for all kinds of really weird political reasons that were going on in 1864. Like, Abraham Lincoln had to run for re-election while the Civil War was happening, and he picked a Democrat for weird political reasons anyway. We had 3 Democratic presidents in that period. Andrew Johnson, who happened because Abraham Lincoln died. Grover Cleveland, and Woodrow Wilson. And something weird had to happen for each of these 3. Like, all of these 3, none of these, like, this is what I mean about, like, the Democrats were the overdogs and the Democrats were the underdogs. Like, we had 3 Democratic presidents during this time. Cumulatively, they were in office for, like, more than 10 years. More than 10 years out of the 90 years in this period. And that's no, it would have been, like 18 years. 18 years, about, give or take, in this 90-year period. So that's a decent chunk. But something weird had to happen every time a Democrat was elected for the first time. It seems like for both Woodrow Wilson and Grover Cleveland were reelected, but when they were elected in the first place, something weird had to happen each time. So Andrew Johnson, he was really weird. He was never elected. He was just Lincoln's vice president. Woodrow Wilson, if you know about any election from this whole period, you probably know about how Woodrow Wilson was elected, because he was elected in 1912 when Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft split the Republican ticket. Like, there was this big internal divide among the Republicans that split the Republican Party in 2 and let the Democrats kind of win by default. That's what it took for Woodrow Wilson to get office. So of these 3 presidents, we have one who took office because he was vice president. He was Lincoln's vice president. The second only took office because the Republican Party was just like tearing itself in half at the time. Reasons for that are interesting, but covered pretty well elsewhere. Like, look up the Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft rivalry. It's fascinating. The third one people don't talk about that much, which I think is a shame, because which election was it? 92. It would have been, I have a few reference points in my head, but around that I have to like do some math to figure it out. 1884. I think it would have been the 1884 election. That was when Grover Cleveland, the third, like the middle of these 3, it was like Andrew Johnson, Grover Cleveland, Woodrow, Andrew Johnson in the 1860s, Grover Cleveland around 1890, and then Woodrow Wilson during World War II in like the 1910s. So Grover Cleveland happened in this middle. Grover Cleveland happened during the period of American history that is perhaps the least studied of like all of the periods of U.S. history in like basic US history classes, or at least the period where we talk about presidential politics the least. Like Grover Cleveland is one of those presidents that people know almost nothing about generally. Or if you do know anything about him, if you do know anything about him, I'll bet you know what you know about him. He's the president who served 2 non-consecutive terms. He was elected, and then he lost re-election, but then he ran again and he won it. So he served 2 terms, but like there was another president in the middle. So that's Grover Cleveland. But one thing people don't point out is he actually, when he lost re-election, when he lost re-election after his first term, he actually won the popular vote. He lost the Electoral College, but he won the popular vote. So he actually won the popular vote 3 times in a row. So he, I don't know, he had a, I don't actually know, but I'll bet his supporters were like, he basically won that one. This isn't fair. And that's probably part of the reason why he was able to make that comeback, because he was able to say like, hey, I basically won that last one anyway. I lost, but I basically won. Like, so 1884 was the election that brought Grover Cleveland into the presidency. Let me set the stage for it a little bit, okay? So the Civil War happens, right? And then there's Reconstruction. The North is basically ruling the South by like military might. Although the South gains back political power pretty quickly. All of this is a pretty like kind of a hot topic. People have strong feeling. Like every time during any of this that I've started talking about the Civil War, I feel like I'm treading on dangerous ground, because people are a little sensitive about people misrepresenting exactly how the Civil War went. Because we're still not over it as a country. But let's skip ahead to 1876. So this is 8 years before the election I really want to talk about. In 1876, Ulysses S. Grant has been president for 8 years. He's been supporting Reconstruction, but Ulysses S. Grant is so corrupt. Maybe not personally, but like all of the people under him, all the people he appointed, they were so corrupt. He like, I don't know a lot of the details, but he just has this reputation as just this drunk who just sullied the presidency. Which is a shame, because like his party was fighting for like the liberation of the slaves. Like maybe maybe that's not how the Civil War started, but during Reconstruction that's how people felt about it. Like that the Republican Party was at least framing itself by that point, by the 1870s, as like, we are liberating the slaves. We are turning this into a truly free country for the first time. And Grant was supportive of that. But he also basically ruined the moral credibility of the whole Reconstruction project by being so corrupt, or by being so drunk and incompetent and letting people be so corrupt around him. So 1876 rolls around, and there's a Republican candidate and a Democratic candidate, and it's really, really, really close. And it's looking like it can kind of go either way. It's looking like it might go, I forget how this works. Like, it's looking like, basically, it's looking like it's close enough that a whole bunch of political leaders at the time could basically, I forget how this worked. Did it go to the Supreme Court? Did it go to the House of Representatives? One of those two happened, I think. Like, it was basically up to a whole bunch of politicians who the next president was going to be, because the election was so close. And the Democrats and Republicans struck a deal. The Republicans would get the presidency, but in return, the military would leave the South. This was basically the end of Reconstruction. This was the compromise where where the Republicans essentially sold the whole Reconstruction project in return for the presidency. I feel like that was a shame, but that's not what I really want to talk about today. Point is, Republicans have been in office continuously since Lincoln, like briefly interrupted by Andrew Johnson there, who screwed things up a little bit. But basically, Republicans get the presidency in this compromise of 1876. I think it's technically called the Compromise of 1877, whatever. And Rutherford, the Republican president, who got the presidency at the time, was Rutherford B. Hayes, and he's famous for like restoring the morality of the presidential office after it had been like sullied by Grant. And then after Rutherford B. Hayes was Garfield, and then Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur was interesting. So let me talk about Chester A. Arthur for a second, because look up a picture of Chester A. Arthur. Look it up. Pause the video and look up a picture of Chester A. Arthur. You don't really have to, but if you really don't want to look up a picture of Chester A. Arthur, if you can't because you're doing something with your hands or whatever, then let me just tell you, he's friend-shaped. I don't know. He has a face like a teddy bear. I want to give him a hug every time I see a picture of Chester A. Arthur. Like, so Garfield was a big reformer. Like, Garfield wanted... once people kind of stopped caring about slavery and Reconstruction, which was basically happening around this time, like, Reconstruction was dying down. Reconstruction had pretty firmly died down. As, like, a big political issue. The thing everyone was talking about was corruption, basically, was Grant and all of the corruption he caused, and people were talking about civil service reform, basically. People didn't like how the president could just, like, fire basically the whole executive branch and reward all of his political supporters by hiring all of them in the federal government, which was a thing that happened a lot back then. It was insane. And people wanted to basically create what we have now. People wanted to create, like, a modern civil service. And that happened kind of in bits and pieces over the course of the whole late 19th century. But that was the big issue at the time. And there were conservatives in the Republican Party who thought that things are basically fine the way they are. But there were also reformers in the Republican Party who wanted, like, what we have now with, like, the civil service system. And so we have these two factions within the Republicans. And Garfield was a reformer, and he picks a conservative from the Republicans, basically to balance the ticket. Like, he wants to unite the whole party behind him against the Democrats. And it works. And he gets elected. And then he dies. Garfield was assassinated pretty quickly into his presidency. And all of the Republican reformers are just heartbroken, because now you have this conservative in office, this conservative, Chester A. Arthur, who's just done nothing his whole political career but protect the whole corrupt system. But Chester A. Arthur surprises everyone, because I don't know if he had a change of heart, or if he had never actually really supported the old system all that much and it had just kind of looked like it from a certain point of view. But when Chester A. Arthur was in office, he supported civil service reform, like, really strongly. And he played a really big part in like, getting rid of the spoils system. He was this big surprise to everybody. Everyone, like, people loved Chester A. Arthur. Like, I love looking at pictures of him. He's so friend-shaped. I love reading stories about him because he won over all of these people trying to clean up the government because by helping them out. Everyone thought he was going to be awful, but he was great. And it has a little bit of a sad ending because, remember a long time ago, I briefly mentioned that, like, SciShow talked about how, like, bad water at the White House might have killed, like, more than one president. Well, the other president it might have killed was Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur did not die in office, but he was very sick towards the end of his term in office. And so everyone kind of understood that he wasn't going to run for re-election, because if he did, he probably wouldn't last very long. And that is what happened. Chester A. Arthur died just a few months out of leaving office. So now we finally get to what I think is one of the most interesting presidential elections of all time, the election of 1884. So, like I said, this whole time, the Republicans are like the overdogs and the Republicans are the underdog. I'm sorry, the Democrats are the underdogs. The Republicans have now had 4 presidents in a row. More if you don't count Andrew Johnson, since he was never elected. Well, okay, whatever. Anyway, but the Republicans nominate this guy. Remember how I said there were basically 2 factions in the Republican Party? There was the reformers and the conservatives. Well, I want you to imagine for a second. All right, so you know Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, right? Bernie Sanders had a reputation, in the 2016 election at least, Bernie Sanders had a reputation for being this pie-in-the-sky utopian, for being unrealistic, for being too radical to make it in a mainstream, in like the general presidential election. Whereas Hillary Clinton had this reputation for being corrupt, for being just sleazy and selfish and unidealistic, and she'll just say whatever she needs in order to be president and doesn't actually have any values. I don't believe either of those things, for the record, but those are that's the reputations. That's the bad thing. That's like the bad things people say about both of those. I want you to imagine those 2 lists of qualities combined into one person. All right? I want you to imagine someone who people see as like too radical and unrealistic to get elected, while also having this reputation for being extremely corrupt and sleazy and having no actual values. It sounds contradictory, but from what I can tell, that was James G. Blaine. That was the man that the Republicans nominated. Which is just ridiculous. Like, how on earth did someone like that get the nomination? To this day, I'm not really sure. But one way or another, he got elected. Like, from what I've read, it's like he got elected mostly because he had all the right friends, which, again, does not help with the whole, like, corruption perception deal. So, James G. Blaine gets the Republican nomination. But then, James G. Blaine gets the Republican nomination. The guy who gets the Democratic nomination is a guy named Grover Cleveland, who is just the polar opposite of Blaine. He's not super radical, but everyone sees him as like honest and trustworthy. People love Grover Cleveland. He was almost Obama-esque. He just has this charisma. No one can bring themselves to hate him too much. He's just, everyone loves Grover Cleveland. People saw him as honest and trustworthy. And not only that, but there was this big scandal that came out from James G. Blaine. Because remember that whole corruption thing? Well, it emerged that someone had basically bribed James G. Blaine when he was in Congress. They sent him a letter that was just like bribing him for his vote. And at the end it said, "Burn this letter," because they were clearly, because it was like records of this just awful, sleazy transaction could not be preserved. But the letter was not burned, and it was eventually discovered by somebody who like leaked it to the press. And soon enough, Grover Cleveland supporters were like chanting, "Burn this letter," in the streets to like make fun of Blaine. And like it was just this huge scandal. And like that's what it took before, like in this period, that's what it took for a Democrat to start to, for it to look realistic, for a Democrat to win. Like, but we're not done yet. We're not actually done yet. The riot's not over. Because it's looking, okay, so it's looking at this point like the Democrat is going to win for the first time since before the Civil War. Like, this would be the first time since before the Civil War, the first time in more than 20 years that a Democrat has won a presidential election. But then Grover Cleveland has a scandal of his own. He apparently had what's the phrase? He had a child out of wedlock. He had a kid by a woman he was not married to. And when word got out about that sullied a little bit his reputation as someone who is honest and trustworthy and virtuous. But then Grover Cleveland just pulls one of the best damage control maneuvers in like the history of politics. Grover Cleveland comes out and says, yes, I had a child by this one. Okay, there's actually no like there's no way to say this that doesn't sound sleazy by today's standards. This was normal for like the 1880s, but basically what he said went like this. That woman was a slut and she slept with loads of people, myself included. I'm not proud of it, but me and loads of other men slept with this woman. Then she got pregnant, and I, being the upstanding, virtuous man that I am, decided to take responsibility for this child, and I have been funding this, I have been, like, paying for this child's rearing ever since. I have been helping to, I've basically been paying child support this whole time because I was financially able to, of all of the men who were sleeping with her at the time. The slut. It's kind of gross by today's standards, but it worked. Grover Cleveland managed to spin the I had a child out of wedlock story into another story about how amazing and virtuous Grover Cleveland was. It reminds me a little bit of, well, never mind. Point is, it was just this moment of like the fact that he was able to like say that like, yes, I did this and I'm not proud of it. Like his humility almost made him look even better. But it looked like it wasn't enough. Like it was really good damage control, but it looked at this point, it still looked like Grover Cleveland, this scandal really was going to kill him. It looked like Grover Cleveland had like managed to do a lot of really good damage control, but he was still probably going to lose the presidential election. So what happened? A third scandal. This one like right before the election. This election of 1884 has 3 major scandals, like one after the other. And that is why I love, that is why I think this election is the most interesting. First, I don't know if I got the order of them right, chronologically actually, but the way I remember it is that the first one, James G. Blaine had a scandal, then Grover Cleveland had a scandal, then James G. Blaine had another scandal. So, a little bit of context for this one. What you need to understand is that the Democrats were really, really popular in the South, but there were also a decent number of Democrats in the North, and the Democrats were particularly popular among the urban poor in northern cities. Like, in northern cities, New York City and Boston and Chicago and such, the Democrats were popular among, like, the urban poor, and especially immigrants, and especially Catholic immigrants. The Democrat, because like the Democrats were kind of the party of slavery at the time, and the party of the South, and the party of like segregation and racism, but like I think of them as they were basically the party of the poor white man. Like the Republicans essentially created this alliance between blacks and like rich capitalists. Like that was the Republican alliance for this whole period, and and also, like, they had lots of other demographics on their side. But the Democrats were the party of the poor whites, of the poor white men. And a lot of poor white men were Catholic. And the whereas the Republicans were kind of, I don't know, a conservative party. And by conservative party, I kind of mean, like, I don't know, like, it's not exactly how we think of conservative today, but it is a little bit. It's like traditional values. They saw themselves as upholding capitalism and big business, but they kind of tied that in with like piety and like a particular flavor of Protestant Christianity. Like, they saw it as, they tied in capitalism with like this Protestant work ethic of like being a hard worker. And as such, the temperance movement that eventually got prohibition, like the people who wanted to like outlaw alcohol and such, they tended to mostly be Republican because of that whole attitude of like, you know, hard work, piety, Christianity, like that tied in really closely with prohibition. And that was not popular among Catholics. In fact, that whole particular model of what Christianity means tended to be pretty, like, suspicious of Catholics and suspicious of immigrants and suspicious of, like, anything except this very particular idea of, like, sort of Puritan Protestant Christianity. So all of these Catholics in northern cities are voting Democrat, right? So anyway, H.G. Blaine has this big campaign rally. And as happens with these things, lots of people besides Blaine speak at this thing. And there's this one pastor, preacher, this one person gets up there, and he gives a speech where he says what a lot of people think, but you're not supposed to say. Because remember how the Republican Party was, you know, it's kind of, you know, it being tied in with this particular idea of Protestant Christianity made it really suspicious of Catholics and immigrants. At the same time, they kind of needed a lot of those votes to win. And a big reason they were doing that was like, hey, you can't trust Grover Cleveland, he's a sleazeball. He had this child out of wedlock, and also, so yeah. And anyway, this pastor, like, the Republicans kind of need the votes of a lot of these poor immigrants. Like, they weren't solidly for Democrats, they were mostly for Democrats, but the Republicans were successfully peeling a lot of them away in this particular election. But then, this pastor gets up there, and he says how the Republicans really feel about the Catholic immigrants. He says that we shall not allow this country to fall into the hands of the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Those were his words. Rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Rum, because again, like, prohibition and the temperance movement were mostly a Republican thing, while the Democrats were mostly the ones who were opposing that and were like, no, let's keep booze. Romanism, because that was basically the, like, Catholic slur of the time. And rebellion, because the Democrats were the party of the South during the Civil War. So this guy basically just lumped in all Catholics with, like, the Southern rebels who were really unpopular in the North at this time. He lumps in all the Catholics with all the Southerners, and furthermore, he basically plays into this idea of, like, all Catholic immigrants being drunks. And the Catholic immigrants did not take kindly to this. And just barely enough of them are so turned off by this. Like, this wasn't supposed to leave that room, by the way. Like, this was basically leaked to the press. That was supposed to stay in that room. It was a big campaign rally, but I don't know exactly how they thought they were going to keep that a secret. But the press got wind of it, and suddenly everyone is talking about how the Republican Party thinks that the Democrats stand for rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Like, everyone is talking about that quote, rum, Romanism, and rebellion, and the Catholics are just so offended. And enough of them go back to the Democrats that Grover Cleveland just barely manages to win the presidency. And that's how Grover Cleveland became one of only 3 Democratic presidents that we had between the Civil War and the Great Depression. From one president got in office because he was Lincoln's vice president for weird political reasons. The second was Woodrow Wilson, who only got elected because the Republican Party split itself in half. And the third was Grover Cleveland, who only managed to become president because the Republicans nominated a guy who had all of the radicalism of Bernie Sanders combined with all of the sleaziness of Hillary Clinton, and managed to have 2 massive scandals over the course of the election. That's what it took to get the third Democrat in that period of U.S. history.